Deep within the misty hollows of Appalachia, where morning fog clings to ancient ridgelines and cell towers still can't penetrate, there existed families whose bloodlines carried secrets darker than the mountain shadows themselves. These weren't the typical tales of moonshine stills or feuding neighbors that populate local folklore. These were clans who practiced rituals so disturbing that even today, historians refuse to document them fully, fearing that mere knowledge might somehow resurrect what was meant to stay buried. For generations, these isolated communities maintained traditions that predated European settlement, blending indigenous practices with occult beliefs brought from the Old World. They lived by codes that ordinary people couldn't comprehend, following lunar calendars and seasonal cycles that governed ceremonies most would consider unthinkable. What makes these accounts particularly chilling isn't just their content, but the fact that physical evidence of their practices continues to surface in remote locations throughout the region. Archaeological discoveries in recent decades have uncovered artifacts that official reports describe only in the most clinical terms, if they acknowledge them at all. Stone circles arranged in patterns that serve no agricultural purpose. Underground chambers with walls blackened by substances that carbon dating reveals are centuries old. Human remains positioned in configurations that suggest they were placed deliberately, not buried according to any known Christian or indigenous custom. The families I'm about to describe weren't simply eccentric mountain folk with unusual customs. They were organized communities who believed their survival depended on maintaining contact with forces that existed beyond ordinary human understanding. Their rituals weren't performed out of malice or madness, but from a genuine conviction that these practices protected them from threats, both seen and unseen. They viewed themselves as guardians of ancient knowledge, keepers of power that could ensure their bloodlines would endure when others perished. What makes these accounts particularly unsettling is how methodical these clans were in their approach. They didn't stumble into these practices accidentally or adopt them during moments of desperation. Instead, they systematically developed and refined their rituals over generations, passing down detailed instructions through oral tradition and carefully maintained written records. Some of these documents, discovered during estate sales or property excavations, reveal a level of organization that suggests these weren't isolated incidents, but coordinated efforts across multiple family groups. The rituals themselves varied significantly between clans, but they shared common elements that appear consistently across different regions and time periods. Most involved the careful collection and preservation of organic materials, particularly those taken from living beings during specific lunar phases. Many required the participation of entire family groups, including children who were initiated into these practices from an early age, and virtually all were conducted in locations that had been consecrated through previous ceremonies, creating sacred sites that accumulated power over decades or centuries of use. These weren't weekend hobbyists dabbling in folk magic. These were communities whose entire social structure revolved around their ritual calendar. They planned marriages, births, and major life decisions around ceremonial requirements. They selected their dwelling places based on proximity to natural features that enhanced their practices. They maintained detailed genealogical records, not just for family history, but because bloodline purity was essential to their rituals' effectiveness. The geographic isolation of Appalachian communities provided perfect cover for these activities. Mountain hollows that remained inaccessible except on foot created natural barriers against outside interference. The region's history of suspicious attitudes toward government authority meant that residents rarely cooperated with official investigations, and the prevalence of legitimate folk traditions provided convenient explanations for any unusual behavior that might attract attention. But isolation alone doesn't explain how these practices persisted for so long without detection. These clans were remarkably skilled at maintaining dual identities. During daylight hours and in public settings, they appeared to be ordinary mountain families engaged in typical rural activities. They operated farms, ran small businesses, and participated in community events just like their neighbors. Children attended local schools when they existed, and families maintained social relationships with non-practicing households. This carefully constructed normalcy was essential to their survival. Unlike the stereotypical image of isolated cultists living in complete separation from society, these families understood that total isolation would eventually attract unwanted attention. Instead, they created the appearance of integration while maintaining their separate ritual lives in complete secrecy. They developed elaborate systems of signals and coded language that allowed them to communicate about ceremonial matters, even in public settings. The few outsiders who discovered evidence of these practices faced a choice between silence and consequences that discouraged further investigation. Local law enforcement, when it existed, was often connected to these families through marriage or business relationships. County officials found that pursuing certain lines of inquiry led to administrative obstacles that made their jobs increasingly difficult, and researchers who attempted to document these traditions discovered that their sources would suddenly become unavailable or their notes would mysteriously disappear. What's particularly disturbing about these accounts is how they challenge our assumptions about rural American history. We tend to think of isolated mountain communities as bastions of traditional Christian values, places where old-fashioned morality persisted long after urban areas had become corrupted by modern influences. But these families represent a parallel tradition that existed alongside and sometimes within supposedly Christian communities, maintaining practices that were fundamentally incompatible with any conventional religious framework. The rituals I'm about to describe weren't performed by people who had rejected Christianity in favor of something else. Many of these families maintained the appearance of Christian observance, attending church services, and participating in community religious activities, but their true spiritual lives centered around practices that drew from much older traditions, beliefs that treated the natural world as a repository of power that could be accessed through proper ritual procedures. This religious duality created a unique form of psychological compartmentalization. Family members learned to navigate between two completely different worldviews, shifting seamlessly between conventional Christian behavior and participation in ceremonies that would have horrified their neighbors. Children grew up understanding that certain knowledge was never to be shared outside the family, that their survival depended on maintaining this separation between their public and private spiritual lives. The effectiveness of this compartmentalization is evident in how long these practices continued without detection. Some of the families I'll describe maintained their ritual traditions for over a century, passing them down through multiple generations while successfully concealing their activities from outside observers. It was only through chance discoveries, deathbed confessions, or accidental exposure that evidence of their practices eventually came to light. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these accounts is how they suggest that similar practices might still be continuing today. The families I'm about to describe didn't simply disappear when their activities were discovered. In most cases, they relocated to more remote areas or adopted even more sophisticated concealment methods. The same geographic and social conditions that protected their ancestors continue to exist throughout Appalachia, creating environments where secretive communities could still operate without detection. Modern technology has created new challenges for maintaining such secrecy, but it has also provided new tools for those determined to preserve their traditions. GPS systems can identify truly isolated locations that remain inaccessible to casual observers. Encrypted communications allow for coordination between separated family groups, and the decline of traditional rural communities has created abandoned properties that could serve as perfect locations for activities that require complete privacy. The 7 families I'm about to describe represent only a fraction of the clans that practiced these dark rituals throughout Appalachian history. These are simply the ones whose activities were documented well enough to allow for detailed reconstruction of their practices. For each family whose story can be told, there are likely dozens more whose secrets died with them, taking their knowledge to graves that were positioned according to ritual requirements rather than Christian custom. What makes these particular accounts so compelling is the level of detail that survived. Through a combination of written records, physical evidence, and testimony from family members who eventually broke their silence, we can reconstruct not just what these families did, but how they understood their actions within their own spiritual framework. These weren't random acts of violence or expressions of mental illness, but carefully planned ceremonies that served specific purposes within belief systems that had been refined over generations. The families arranged in order from least to most disturbing, not because any of these practices could be considered acceptable, but because some represent more extreme departures from conventional human behavior than others. Each family's story builds upon themes established by the previous accounts, creating a progression that reveals how these dark traditions evolved and intensified over time. As we explore these accounts, remember that these weren't ancient practices from distant civilizations. These were American families living in communities that still exist today, maintaining traditions that were passed down through bloodlines that continue to this day. The mountains that concealed their activities still rise from the same valleys, and the natural features that enhanced their rituals remain unchanged by the passage of time. The question isn't whether these practices actually occurred, because the physical evidence makes that undeniable. The question is whether they truly ended, or whether they simply became more sophisticated in their concealment. In an age where few mysteries remain unsolved, The Appalachian Mountains continue to guard secrets that resist all attempts at complete revelation. What transforms these accounts from mere historical curiosities into something far more unsettling is the systematic nature of how these families organized their activities. Unlike isolated incidents of aberrant behavior, these clans developed sophisticated networks that spanned multiple counties and sometimes entire states. They maintained communication through coded letters, shared resources for their ceremonies, and even arranged marriages between families to strengthen their ritual capabilities. This wasn't random deviance, but coordinated preservation of traditions they considered essential to their survival. The complexity of these networks becomes apparent when examining the archaeological evidence discovered throughout the region. Stone markers found in remote locations display identical symbols despite being separated by hundreds of miles. Underground chambers, constructed in different states, share architectural features that suggest common design principles, and burial sites scattered across the Appalachian Range reveal similar positioning patterns that indicate shared ritual purposes. These similarities couldn't have emerged accidentally, pointing to active communication and coordination between widely separated family groups. Perhaps most disturbing is how these families adapted their practices to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential character. As law enforcement became more sophisticated, they developed more elaborate concealment methods. When transportation improved and brought more outsiders into their territories, they created multiple backup locations for their ceremonies. And as modern technology threatened their secrecy, they found ways to incorporate new tools into their ancient practices without compromising their spiritual effectiveness. The financial resources required for these activities also reveal the extent of their organization. The materials needed for their ceremonies weren't items that could be casually gathered from the surrounding forest. Many required extensive preparation, specialized tools, and ingredients that had to be obtained through carefully maintained supply chains. Some families maintained workshops where they crafted ritual implements using techniques passed down through generations. Others developed trading relationships with distant communities that could provide materials unavailable in their local environment. These economic networks created additional layers of protection for their activities. Suppliers who provided materials for ritual purposes had strong incentives to maintain secrecy, as exposure would destroy their customer base. Local businesses that served these families often became unwitting participants in their concealment, providing cover stories for unusual purchases or unexplained absences. And the families themselves generated income through legitimate enterprises that funded their ceremonial activities while maintaining their public facades. The psychological impact of maintaining such elaborate deceptions cannot be overstated. Family members lived in constant awareness that discovery would bring catastrophic consequences, not just for themselves, but for their entire bloodline. Children learned from infancy that certain knowledge was literally a matter of life and death, that careless words could destroy everything their ancestors had built. This created a form of psychological conditioning that made betrayal almost impossible, as breaking silence would violate the deepest foundations of their identity. But this psychological pressure also created internal tensions that sometimes led to devastating conflicts within families. Not every member embraced their inherited traditions with equal enthusiasm. Some questioned practices they found increasingly difficult to justify. Others struggled with the burden of maintaining such profound secrets while living seemingly normal lives. And occasionally, someone would reach a breaking point where the psychological cost of continued participation became unbearable. When internal conflicts reached crisis points, the families had established procedures for dealing with dissent. These weren't crude applications of force, but sophisticated psychological techniques designed to restore compliance without creating martyrs or additional security risks. Family members who expressed doubts would be subjected to intensive re-education processes that reinforced their commitment to the traditions. Those who proved resistant might be isolated from sensitive activities while remaining within the family structure, and in extreme cases, permanent solutions ensured that dangerous knowledge couldn't be shared with outsiders. The effectiveness of these internal controls is evident in how rarely these families experienced significant defections. Despite the psychological strain of maintaining such elaborate deceptions, most family members remained loyal to their traditions throughout their lives. Even those who privately questioned specific practices rarely challenged the fundamental beliefs that justified their family's activities. This loyalty wasn't maintained through fear alone, but through genuine conviction that their traditions served essential purposes that outsiders couldn't understand. The spiritual framework that supported these practices deserves particular attention because it reveals how these families understood their activities within broader cosmic contexts. They didn't view their rituals as violations of natural law, but as applications of principles that conventional society had forgotten or chosen to ignore. They believed they were maintaining balance between seen and unseen forces, ensuring that their communities would survive challenges that would destroy less prepared populations. This worldview created a sense of superiority that helped justify practices that would otherwise be morally indefensible. These families saw themselves as guardians of ancient wisdom, protectors of knowledge that was too dangerous for ordinary people to possess. They believed their bloodlines carried special responsibilities that required them to perform ceremonies that others would find abhorrent. This sense of divine mission transformed what outsiders would consider criminal acts into sacred duties that couldn't be abandoned without catastrophic consequences. The children born into these families faced unique challenges that shaped their entire approach to life. From earliest consciousness, they learned that the world contained two distinct realities: the public sphere, where certain rules applied, and the private sphere, where entirely different principles governed behavior. They developed extraordinary abilities to compartmentalize their experiences, maintaining perfect facades while participating in activities that would traumatize most adults. This psychological flexibility became their greatest asset, but also their most profound burden. Education within these families followed patterns that reinforced their separation from conventional society. Children learned traditional academic subjects well enough to avoid attracting attention, but their real education centered on ritual knowledge that was considered infinitely more important than anything taught in public schools. They memorized genealogies that traced their bloodlines back centuries, studied calendars that tracked celestial cycles affecting their ceremonies and mastered techniques that required years of practice to perform correctly. The gender roles within these families differed significantly from conventional Appalachian communities, reflecting the specific requirements of their ritual practices. Women often held positions of authority that would have been unusual in traditional mountain society, particularly in ceremonies that required certain types of spiritual sensitivity. Men performed roles that demanded physical strength and emotional detachment, handling aspects of their rituals that women were considered unsuited for, and children of both genders participated in activities that prepared them for their adult responsibilities within the family structure. These role assignments weren't arbitrary, but reflected generations of experimentation that had identified the most effective ways to organize their activities. Families that ignored these patterns found their ceremonies less successful, while those that adhered to traditional arrangements experienced better outcomes. This practical feedback reinforced their conviction that their practices were based on genuine spiritual principles rather than mere superstition. The seasonal cycles that governed these families' activities created rhythms of life that differed dramatically from their neighbors' agricultural patterns. While other mountain families planned their activities around farming schedules, these clans organized their entire existence around ceremonial requirements that followed lunar phases, planetary alignments, and natural phenomena that most people ignored. This created additional challenges for maintaining their public facades, as they had to find explanations for behavior that didn't match typical rural patterns. The most intensive periods of ritual activity occurred during specific times of year when cosmic conditions were considered most favorable for their purposes. These periods required extensive preparation, careful coordination between family members, and absolute secrecy to prevent discovery. Families would sometimes travel considerable distances to reach locations where their ceremonies could be performed safely, creating additional opportunities for exposure that had to be carefully managed. During these peak activity periods, the psychological strain on family members intensified dramatically. The combination of physical demands, emotional intensity, and security concerns created conditions that tested everyone's commitment to their traditions. Some family members found these experiences spiritually exhilarating, confirming their belief in the importance of their practices. Others struggled with aspects of their ceremonies that challenged their personal comfort levels, and a few discovered that their theoretical commitment to their family's traditions couldn't withstand the reality of direct participation. The aftermath of these intensive ceremonial periods required careful attention to ensure that family members could return to their normal routines without attracting suspicion. Physical evidence had to be disposed of properly. Ritual sites had to be concealed or restored to their previous condition, and participants had to process their experiences in ways that didn't compromise their ability to function in conventional society. This transition period was often the most vulnerable time for security breaches, as family members struggled to readjust to their public personas while still processing intense ceremonial experiences. The 7 families, whose stories I'm about to reveal, represent different approaches to managing these challenges, different solutions to the fundamental problem of maintaining ancient traditions in a modern world that had no place for such practices. Each family's story illuminates different aspects of this hidden history, revealing how these dark traditions adapted and evolved while maintaining their essential character across generations of secrecy. What distinguished these families from ordinary mountain communities wasn't just their secretive practices, but their ability to maintain multiple generations of absolute loyalty to traditions that would have horrified their neighbors. This loyalty wasn't achieved through simple intimidation or fear, but through a complex system of psychological conditioning that began before children could even speak. Infants were exposed to ceremonial environments from birth, creating neural pathways that associated these activities with safety and family connection rather than fear or revulsion. The process of indoctrination was so gradual and thorough that most family members never experienced a moment of conscious choice about their participation. By the time children were old enough to understand the full implications of their family's activities, they were already so deeply integrated into the system that rebellion would have meant abandoning everything they understood about their identity and purpose. This wasn't accidental, but represented generations of refined psychological manipulation designed to ensure absolute compliance. The families developed sophisticated methods for identifying children who might prove resistant to their traditions. Certain personality traits, observable from early childhood, indicated potential problems with future compliance. Children who showed excessive empathy, questioned authority too persistently, or demonstrated strong connections to outsiders were subjected to additional conditioning designed to redirect these tendencies. Those who remained resistant despite intensive intervention faced increasingly severe consequences until they either submitted or were permanently silenced. But the most chilling aspect of these family systems was how they created genuine believers rather than mere participants. Through carefully controlled exposure to their ritual practices, combined with elaborate mythological frameworks that explained their significance, these families produced individuals who genuinely believed their ceremonies served essential purposes. Ooh. These weren't people who participated reluctantly in activities they knew were wrong, but true believers who considered their practices morally superior to conventional behavior. The mythological systems that supported these beliefs were remarkably sophisticated, incorporating elements from multiple spiritual traditions while maintaining internal consistency that could withstand casual scrutiny. These weren't crude superstitions, but elaborate theological frameworks that provided detailed explanations for why their practices were necessary, how they worked, and what consequences would follow if they were abandoned. Family members could articulate complex philosophical justifications for their activities that made perfect sense within their belief systems. These belief systems also provided frameworks for understanding the outside world that reinforced their sense of superiority and justified their secrecy. They viewed conventional society as spiritually impoverished, populated by people who had lost touch with fundamental forces that governed reality. They saw themselves as preserving essential knowledge that would be needed when ordinary civilization inevitably collapsed under the weight of its own ignorance. This perspective transformed their isolation from a burden into a sacred responsibility. The families maintained detailed records of their activities that reveal the extraordinary complexity of their organizational systems. These documents, written in coded languages that required special knowledge to interpret, tracked everything from genealogical information to ceremonial schedules to resource management. Some families maintained libraries of hundreds of volumes that contained instructions for rituals, interpretations of natural phenomena, and historical accounts of their ancestors' activities. These collections represented centuries of accumulated knowledge that was considered too dangerous for outsiders to possess. The preservation of these records required elaborate security measures that protected them from both accidental discovery and deliberate destruction. Documents were hidden in specially constructed chambers that were designed to survive natural disasters, concealed in locations that were known only to senior family members, and copied multiple times to ensure that essential knowledge couldn't be lost through single points of failure. Some families developed encryption systems that made their records indecipherable even if they were discovered by unauthorized persons. The geographic distribution of these families created a network that spanned the entire Appalachian region, with concentrations in areas that offered the best combination of isolation and natural resources. Mountain valleys that remained inaccessible except during specific seasons provided perfect locations for activities that required absolute privacy. Cave systems that extended deep underground offered storage for materials and documents that couldn't be kept in conventional buildings. And natural features like springs, rock formations, and old-growth forests provided elements that were essential for their ceremonial purposes. The families developed sophisticated mapping systems that tracked not just physical locations, but temporal factors that affected their activities. They maintained calendars that predicted optimal times for different types of ceremonies, weather patterns that would provide cover for their activities, and seasonal changes that affected the availability of necessary materials. This information was so detailed that they could plan their activities months or even years in advance, ensuring that everything would be perfectly coordinated when the time came for action. The economic systems that supported these activities were equally complex, involving multiple layers of legitimate and illegitimate enterprises that generated the resources needed for their ceremonies. Some families operated conventional businesses that provided cover for unusual purchases and explained their financial resources. Others maintained trading relationships with distant communities that could supply materials unavailable in their local areas. And a few developed criminal enterprises that funded their activities while maintaining careful separation from their ritual practices. The most successful families were those that achieved perfect integration between their economic activities and their ceremonial needs. They established businesses that naturally required the same materials used in their rituals, created trading relationships that provided cover for suspicious activities, and developed financial systems that could support their practices without creating obvious connections between their legitimate and illegitimate activities. This integration was so seamless that outside observers would never suspect that apparently normal businesses were actually supporting elaborate ritual practices. The families also developed sophisticated intelligence networks that monitored potential threats to their security. They maintained contacts within local law enforcement, government agencies, and religious organizations that could provide advance warning of investigations or other dangerous developments. They tracked the movements of researchers, journalists, and other outsiders who might accidentally discover evidence of their activities, and they maintained detailed profiles of their neighbors that helped them predict how different individuals might react to suspicious behavior. These intelligence operations required careful coordination between family members who had infiltrated various institutions and those who remained focused on their ritual activities. Information had to be gathered, analyzed, and acted upon without creating connections that could expose the entire network. This required sophisticated communication systems that could operate across long distances without leaving traces that investigators could follow. Some families developed their own codes and encryption methods that were so complex they required years of training to master. The psychological profiles that these families maintained on potential threats were extraordinarily detailed, incorporating not just behavioral observations, but deep analysis of individual motivations, weaknesses, and pressure points. They understood that different people required different approaches to ensure their silence or cooperation. Some could be bought with money or favors, others could be intimidated through carefully applied pressure, and a few required more permanent solutions to prevent them from becoming ongoing security risks. The family's approach to law enforcement was particularly sophisticated, involving multiple strategies designed to prevent official investigations while maintaining the appearance of cooperation when contact was unavoidable. They cultivated relationships with local sheriffs and deputies that provided them with advance warning of potential problems. They made strategic donations to political campaigns that ensured friendly officials would be in positions of authority, and they developed elaborate systems for destroying evidence and creating alibis that could withstand casual scrutiny. When official investigations did occur, these families had prepared responses that redirected attention away from their actual activities while providing plausible explanations for any suspicious evidence that might be discovered. They maintained cover stories that explained unusual purchases, unexplained absences, and other potentially incriminating behavior. They had alibis prepared for key family members that could account for their whereabouts during times when ceremonies were conducted, and they had contingency plans for relocating their activities to backup locations if their primary sites were compromised. The most effective strategy these families employed was their ability to hide in plain sight, maintaining such convincing facades of normalcy that investigators would never suspect them of engaging in unusual activities. They participated in community events, maintained social relationships with their neighbors, and contributed to local charities in ways that established their reputations as solid citizens. This public persona was so carefully constructed that even extended investigation would find nothing more suspicious than the minor eccentricities that characterized most rural families. The children raised within these systems faced unique challenges that shaped their entire approach to life in ways that persisted long after they reached adulthood. They learned to navigate between multiple realities, maintaining perfect facades while participating in activities that would have traumatized most people. They developed extraordinary abilities to compartmentalize their experiences, keeping their ritual knowledge completely separate from their interactions with the outside world. And they acquired skills in deception and manipulation that served them well in their adult lives, but also created profound psychological burdens that many struggled to bear. The educational systems within these families were designed to produce individuals who could function effectively in both worlds while maintaining absolute loyalty to their traditions. Children learned conventional subjects well enough to avoid attracting attention, but their real education centered on ritual knowledge that was considered infinitely more valuable than anything taught in public schools. They memorized genealogies that traced their bloodlines back centuries, studied astronomical cycles that governed their ceremonies, and mastered techniques that required years of practice to perform correctly. The most gifted children were selected for advanced training that prepared them for leadership roles within their families. These individuals received instruction in complex subjects like psychology, pharmacology, and organizational management that equipped them to maintain their family's traditions while adapting to changing circumstances. They learned to recognize and exploit human weaknesses, to manipulate group dynamics, and to make decisions that balanced immediate needs against long-term strategic considerations. This training produced individuals who were extraordinarily capable but also profoundly dangerous to anyone who threatened their family's interests. The 7 families, whose stories I'm about to reveal, each developed unique approaches to these fundamental challenges, creating different solutions to the problem of maintaining ancient traditions in a modern world that had no place for such practices. Their stories illuminate different aspects of this hidden history, revealing how these dark traditions adapted and evolved while maintaining their essential character across generations of secrecy and deception. These families understood that their survival depended not just on secrecy, but on creating systems so resilient that they could withstand generations of external pressure while maintaining their essential practices. They developed what could only be described as shadow societies, complete social structures that operated parallel to conventional mountain communities while remaining completely invisible to outside observers. These weren't simple family units, but complex organizations with hierarchies, specializations, and institutional knowledge that rivaled any legitimate enterprise. The leadership structures within these families reflected generations of refinement, with authority distributed according to principles that maximized both effectiveness and security. Elder family members held ultimate decision-making power, but operational responsibilities were delegated to individuals whose specific talents made them most suitable for particular roles. Some family members specialized in maintaining external relationships, presenting friendly faces to the outside world, while gathering intelligence about potential threats. Others focused on the technical aspects of their ceremonies, mastering complex procedures that required years of study to perform correctly. The most crucial positions were held by individuals who served as bridges between their family's hidden world and conventional society. These people maintained legitimate careers, participated in community activities, and established reputations that provided cover for their family's activities. They often achieved positions of respect and influence that made it virtually impossible for outsiders to suspect their true allegiances. School teachers, business owners, church deacons, and even law enforcement officers served these dual roles, using their public positions to protect their family's interests while appearing to be model citizens. The financial systems that supported these operations were masterpieces of complexity, involving multiple layers of legitimate businesses, carefully managed investments, and resource allocation methods that left no traceable connections between their public enterprises and their private activities. Some families established trading networks that spanned multiple states, creating supply chains that could provide exotic materials while maintaining plausible explanations for unusual purchases. Others developed manufacturing capabilities that produced items needed for their ceremonies while generating products that could be sold to unsuspecting customers. The families maintained detailed cost accounting systems that tracked every expense associated with their activities, from the materials needed for specific rituals to the bribes required to ensure official cooperation. These records reveal the extraordinary financial resources required to maintain their operations, resources that had to be generated through legitimate means while avoiding any activities that might attract unwanted attention. The most successful families were those that achieved perfect integration between their economic activities and their ceremonial needs, creating businesses that naturally required the same materials and services used in their rituals. The procurement of specialized materials required elaborate networks that could obtain items from distant locations without creating suspicious patterns of activity. Some materials could only be harvested during specific lunar phases, requiring careful timing and coordination between widely separated family members. Others had to be prepared using techniques that took months to complete, demanding long-term planning and storage capabilities that could preserve delicate substances without degradation. The most challenging materials were those that required active participation from unwilling subjects, creating security risks that had to be carefully managed to prevent exposure. The families developed sophisticated testing procedures that ensured the quality and potency of their materials before incorporating them into their ceremonies. They maintained laboratories hidden within seemingly innocent structures, equipped with tools that could analyze chemical compositions, measure biological activity, and verify the authenticity of substances obtained through their supply networks. These facilities were staffed by family members who had received advanced training in chemistry, biology, and related fields, often through legitimate educational institutions that never suspected how their knowledge would be applied. The storage and preservation of materials required specialized facilities that could maintain optimal conditions for extended periods while remaining completely concealed from outside observers. Some families constructed underground chambers with climate control systems that could preserve organic materials for decades without degradation. Others developed preservation techniques that used natural processes to maintain the potency of their substances, creating stockpiles that could support their activities even during periods when fresh materials were unavailable. The transportation of materials between family members required elaborate security measures that could move dangerous substances across long distances without attracting attention. They developed concealment methods that could hide suspicious items within legitimate cargo, created transportation routes that avoided areas with heavy law enforcement presence, and established communication systems that could coordinate complex logistics without leaving traceable records. Some families maintained their own transportation networks, using vehicles that appeared ordinary but contained hidden compartments designed to conceal materials that would have been impossible to explain if discovered. The families also developed sophisticated methods for disposing of evidence that could incriminate them if discovered by authorities. They maintained furnaces that could completely destroy organic materials, chemical processing facilities that could break down complex substances into unidentifiable components, and burial sites that were designed to prevent the discovery of remains that might raise uncomfortable questions. These disposal methods were so thorough that investigators who later examined suspected activity sites found virtually no physical evidence that could support criminal charges. The psychological conditioning systems that these families employed were perhaps their most sophisticated achievements, creating belief structures so powerful that family members would willingly sacrifice their lives rather than betray their traditions. These systems began before children could speak, incorporating ritual elements into everyday activities in ways that made participation seem natural and inevitable. Infants were exposed to ceremonial environments from birth, creating neural pathways that associated these activities with safety, family connection, and spiritual significance rather than fear or revulsion. The indoctrination process was so gradual and thorough that most family members never experienced a moment of conscious choice about their participation. By the time children were old enough to understand the full implications of their family's activities, they were already so deeply integrated into the system that rebellion would have meant abandoning everything they understood about their identity and purpose. This wasn't accidental, but represented generations of refined psychological manipulation designed to ensure absolute compliance while maintaining the appearance of free choice. The families developed elaborate reward systems that reinforced desired behaviors while discouraging resistance or questioning. Children who demonstrated proper attitudes toward their family's traditions received special privileges, advanced training, and positions of responsibility that enhanced their status within the family structure. Those who showed signs of resistance faced increasingly severe consequences, beginning with social isolation and progressing through various forms of psychological pressure until compliance was achieved or more permanent solutions became necessary. The most effective aspect of these conditioning systems was how they created genuine believers rather than mere participants. Through carefully controlled exposure to their ritual practices, combined with elaborate mythological frameworks that explained their significance, these families produced individuals who genuinely believed their ceremonies served essential purposes. These weren't people who participated reluctantly in activities they knew were wrong, but true believers who considered their practices morally superior to conventional behavior. The mythological systems that supported these beliefs were remarkably sophisticated, incorporating elements from multiple spiritual traditions while maintaining internal consistency that could withstand extended scrutiny. These weren't crude superstitions, but elaborate theological frameworks that provided detailed explanations for why their practices were necessary, how they worked, and what consequences would follow if they were abandoned. Family members could articulate complex philosophical justifications for their activities that made perfect sense within their belief systems while appearing completely insane to outside observers. These belief systems also provided frameworks for understanding the outside world that reinforced their sense of superiority and justified their secrecy. They viewed conventional society as spiritually impoverished, populated by people who had lost touch with fundamental forces that governed reality. They saw themselves as preserving essential knowledge that would be needed when ordinary civilization inevitably collapsed under the weight of its own ignorance. This perspective transformed their isolation from a burden into a sacred responsibility that justified any sacrifice necessary to preserve their traditions. The families maintained extensive libraries of written materials that documented their beliefs, practices, and historical experiences in extraordinary detail. These collections included instructional manuals that provided step-by-step procedures for complex rituals, philosophical treatises that explained the theoretical foundations of their practices, and historical accounts that traced their traditions back through multiple generations. Some families maintained collections of hundreds of volumes that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge considered too dangerous for outsiders to possess. The preservation of these documents required elaborate security measures that protected them from both accidental discovery and deliberate destruction. Texts were hidden in specially constructed chambers designed to survive natural disasters, concealed in locations known only to senior family members, and copied multiple times to ensure that essential knowledge couldn't be lost through single points of failure. Some families developed encryption systems that made their records indecipherable even if they were discovered by unauthorized persons, using codes that required special training to interpret. The families also maintained detailed genealogical records that traced their bloodlines back through multiple generations, documenting not just family relationships, but also the ritual roles and achievements of individual ancestors. These records were considered sacred documents that proved their legitimacy and provided guidance for selecting appropriate participants for specific ceremonies. They revealed patterns of inheritance that determined which family members were suited for particular roles, bloodline connections that enhanced ritual effectiveness, and genetic factors that influenced spiritual sensitivity. The geographic distribution of these families created networks that spanned the entire Appalachian region, with concentrations in areas that offered optimal combinations of isolation and natural resources. They maintained detailed maps that identified not just physical locations, but also temporal factors that affected their activities, tracking everything from seasonal weather patterns to lunar cycles that influenced their ceremonial schedules. This information was so comprehensive that they could plan their activities months or even years in advance, ensuring perfect coordination when the time came for action. The families developed sophisticated communication systems that allowed them to coordinate activities across vast distances without leaving traces that investigators could follow. They used coded languages that appeared to be ordinary conversation but contained hidden meanings that only family members could interpret. They maintained networks of intermediaries who could relay messages between distant family groups without understanding their significance. And they developed timing systems that allowed them to coordinate simultaneous activities across multiple locations without requiring direct communication. The most successful families were those that achieved perfect balance between maintaining their traditions and adapting to changing circumstances. They preserved the essential elements of their practices while modifying peripheral aspects that might attract unwanted attention. They incorporated new technologies that enhanced their capabilities while maintaining traditional methods that had proven effective over generations. And they recruited new members who could strengthen their organizations while maintaining the bloodline purity that their beliefs required. The recruitment process was extraordinarily selective, involving extensive background investigations that could take years to complete. Potential candidates were evaluated not just for their usefulness to the family, but also for their psychological suitability for the lifestyle that membership required. They had to demonstrate absolute loyalty, complete discretion, and the psychological flexibility needed to maintain dual identities without experiencing debilitating internal conflicts. Most importantly, they had to accept the family's belief system so completely that betrayal would be literally unthinkable. The initiation processes that transformed outsiders into family members were elaborate ceremonies that created permanent psychological bonds while providing opportunities to eliminate candidates who proved unsuitable. These rituals were designed to test every aspect of a candidate's character, revealing weaknesses that might pose security risks while strengthening qualities that would make them valuable family members. The process was so intensive that few candidates completed it successfully, but those who did became some of the most dedicated and effective family members. The families also developed sophisticated methods for dealing with members who became security risks through psychological breakdown, substance abuse, or other factors that compromised their reliability. They maintained support systems that could help struggling members overcome their difficulties while monitoring them for signs of potential betrayal. When rehabilitation proved impossible, they had procedures for removing dangerous individuals from sensitive positions while maintaining the appearance that nothing unusual had occurred. And in extreme cases, they had methods for ensuring that critical knowledge couldn't be shared with outsiders, regardless of the former members' intentions. The intelligence networks that these families maintained were perhaps their most valuable assets, providing advance warning of threats while gathering information that could be used to protect their interests. They cultivated relationships with individuals in law enforcement, government agencies, and religious organizations who could provide inside information about investigations or other dangerous developments. They monitored the activities of researchers, journalists, and other outsiders who might accidentally discover evidence of their practices. And they maintained detailed profiles of their neighbors that helped them predict how different individuals might react to suspicious behavior. These intelligence operations required careful coordination between family members who had infiltrated various institutions and those who remained focused on their ritual activities. Information had to be gathered, analyzed, and acted upon without creating connections that could expose the entire network. This required sophisticated communication systems that could operate across long distances without leaving traces that investigators could follow, along with analytical capabilities that could identify patterns and predict future developments based on fragmentary information. The family's approach to law enforcement was particularly sophisticated, involving multiple strategies designed to prevent official investigations while maintaining the appearance of cooperation when contact was unavoidable. They cultivated relationships with local sheriffs and deputies that provided them with advance warning of potential problems while establishing their reputations as law abiding citizens. They made strategic donations to political campaigns that ensured friendly officials would be in positions of authority when decisions affecting their interests were made, and they developed elaborate systems for destroying evidence and creating alibis that could withstand casual scrutiny while avoiding activities that might provoke intensive investigation. When official investigations did occur, these families had prepared responses that redirected attention away from their actual activities while providing plausible explanations for any suspicious evidence that might be discovered. They maintained cover stories that explained unusual purchases, unexplained absences, and other potentially incriminating behavior in ways that satisfied investigators without revealing their true purposes. They had alibis prepared for key family members that could account for their whereabouts during times when ceremonies were conducted, often involving legitimate activities that provided perfect cover for their actual movements. The most effective strategy these families employed was their ability to hide in plain sight, maintaining such convincing facades of normalcy that investigators would never suspect them of engaging in unusual activities. They participated in community events, maintained social relationships with their neighbors, and contributed to local charities in ways that established their reputations as solid citizens whose character was beyond question. This public persona was so carefully constructed that even extended investigation would find nothing more suspicious than the minor eccentricities that characterized most rural families. The children raised within these systems faced unique challenges that shaped their entire approach to life in ways that persisted long after they reached adulthood. They learned to navigate between multiple realities, maintaining perfect facades while participating in activities that would have traumatized most people. They developed extraordinary abilities to compartmentalize their experiences, keeping their ritual knowledge completely separate from their interactions with the outside world, while avoiding the psychological breakdown that such compartmentalization might normally cause. And they acquired skills in deception and manipulation that served them well in their adult lives, but also created profound psychological burdens that many struggled to bear throughout their lives. The educational systems within these families were designed to produce individuals who could function effectively in both worlds while maintaining absolute loyalty to their traditions. Children learned conventional subjects well enough to avoid attracting attention from teachers or other authority figures, but their real education centered on ritual knowledge that was considered infinitely more valuable than anything taught in public schools. They memorized genealogies that traced their bloodlines back centuries, studied astronomical cycles that governed their ceremonies, and mastered techniques that required years of practice to perform correctly. The most gifted children were selected for advanced training that prepared them for leadership roles within their families. These individuals received instruction in complex subjects like psychology, pharmacology, and organizational management that equipped them to maintain their family's traditions while adapting to changing circumstances. They learned to recognize and exploit human weaknesses, to manipulate group dynamics, and to make decisions that balanced immediate needs against long-term strategic considerations. This training produced individuals who were extraordinarily capable but also profoundly dangerous to anyone who threatened their family's interests. The families developed elaborate testing procedures that identified children who possessed the psychological and physical characteristics needed for specific roles within their organizations. Some children showed natural aptitude for the technical aspects of their ceremonies, demonstrating sensitivity to subtle environmental factors that affected ritual outcomes. Others displayed leadership qualities that made them suitable for positions of authority within the family structure, and a few showed particular talent for maintaining external relationships, possessing the social skills needed to function effectively in conventional society while concealing their true allegiances. The specialization that resulted from this selection process created family structures that were remarkably efficient and effective. Each member had clearly defined roles and responsibilities that maximized their individual strengths while minimizing their exposure to activities that might compromise their psychological stability. This division of labor also enhanced security by ensuring that no single individual possessed complete knowledge of the family's activities, making it impossible for any one person to compromise the entire organization, even if they chose to betray their family. The 7 families, whose stories I'm about to reveal, each developed unique approaches to these fundamental challenges, creating different solutions to the problem of maintaining ancient traditions in a modern world that had no place for such practices. Their stories illuminate different aspects of this hidden history, revealing how these dark traditions adapted and evolved while maintaining their essential character across generations of secrecy and deception. What makes these particular accounts so compelling is not just their individual uniqueness, but how they collectively demonstrate the sophisticated methods that these families employed to survive and flourish in environments that should have made their activities impossible to sustain. Each family's survival strategy reflected their understanding that success required not just maintaining their traditions, but evolving them to meet changing circumstances while preserving their essential spiritual power. They recognized that rigid adherence to ancient practices would eventually lead to discovery and destruction, but they also understood that excessive adaptation could dilute their rituals to the point of ineffectiveness. Finding the perfect balance between preservation and evolution became the defining challenge that determined which families thrived and which disappeared into the mountain mists. The most successful families developed what could only be described as institutional memory systems that preserved critical knowledge while allowing for controlled innovation. They maintained detailed records of experimental modifications to their practices, documenting which changes enhanced their rituals' effectiveness and which diminished their power. These records revealed a surprisingly scientific approach to their spiritual activities, with careful observations of variables, systematic testing of alternatives, and rigorous analysis of outcomes that would have impressed any academic researcher. The family's understanding of human psychology was particularly sophisticated, reflecting generations of experience in manipulating individuals and groups to achieve their objectives. They recognized that different people required different approaches to ensure their cooperation or silence, and they developed detailed typologies that categorized potential threats and allies according to their psychological profiles. Some individuals could be controlled through financial incentives, others through carefully applied social pressure, and a few through more direct methods that left no room for resistance. The most dangerous individuals were those who possessed both the knowledge to expose their activities and the moral conviction to act on that knowledge despite personal consequences. These people required special handling that could neutralize their threat while avoiding actions that might create additional problems. The families developed elaborate procedures for identifying such individuals before they became aware of sensitive information, implementing preventive measures that could redirect their attention or remove them from potentially dangerous situations. The family's approach to technology was particularly revealing of their adaptability and forward-thinking strategies. Rather than viewing modern innovations as threats to their traditional practices, they actively sought ways to incorporate new tools that could enhance their capabilities while maintaining their essential spiritual character. They were among the early adopters of communication technologies that could facilitate coordination between distant family members, transportation methods that could move people and materials more efficiently, and analytical tools that could improve their understanding of natural phenomena affecting their rituals. The integration of technology into their practices required careful consideration of how modern tools might affect the spiritual aspects of their activities. They conducted extensive testing to ensure that electronic devices didn't interfere with the subtle energies they believed their ceremonies manipulated. They developed protocols for using technological tools in ways that enhanced rather than diminished their ritual effectiveness. And they created backup systems that could maintain their operations even if their technological resources were compromised or unavailable. The family's financial operations became increasingly sophisticated as they adapted to modern economic systems while maintaining their traditional resource allocation methods. They established legitimate businesses that provided cover for their activities while generating the substantial income required to support their operations. They developed investment strategies that could multiply their resources over time while avoiding patterns that might attract unwanted attention from regulatory authorities. And they created distribution networks that could move money and materials across vast distances without leaving traceable connections to their ritual activities. The most successful families were those that achieved perfect integration between their legitimate enterprises and their ceremonial needs. They established businesses that naturally required the same materials used in their rituals, created employment opportunities for family members that provided cover for their real activities, and developed customer relationships that could be leveraged to obtain information or resources when needed. This integration was so seamless that outside observers would never suspect that apparently normal businesses were actually supporting elaborate ritual practices. The family's approach to education evolved significantly as they recognized that their members needed increasingly sophisticated skills to navigate modern society while maintaining their traditional practices. They encouraged family members to pursue advanced education in fields that could benefit their operations, providing financial support for college and graduate study while ensuring that academic achievement didn't compromise loyalty to family traditions. They developed mentorship programs that paired experienced family members with younger individuals who showed particular promise, creating knowledge transfer systems that preserved critical expertise while adapting it to contemporary circumstances. The most valuable educational investments were in fields that provided practical skills for their operations while establishing legitimate career paths that enhanced their public personas. Family members pursued degrees in chemistry, biology, psychology, business administration, and law enforcement, acquiring expertise that could be applied to their ritual activities while building professional reputations that provided perfect cover for their real interests. Some achieved positions of significant authority within their chosen fields, using their influence to protect family interests while appearing to be model citizens whose character was beyond question. The family's recruitment strategies became increasingly sophisticated as they recognized that their long-term survival required carefully selected additions to their bloodlines. They developed extensive screening processes that could identify potential candidates who possess the psychological characteristics needed for successful integration into their communities. They created elaborate courtship procedures that allowed them to evaluate candidates thoroughly while gradually introducing them to increasingly sensitive aspects of their family life. And they established initiation processes that transformed outsiders into loyal family members while providing opportunities to eliminate those who proved unsuitable. The most challenging aspect of recruitment was ensuring that new members could maintain the psychological compartmentalization required for their dual existence. Candidates had to demonstrate the ability to function effectively in conventional society while participating in activities that would horrify most people. They needed to show absolute loyalty to their adopted family while maintaining relationships with outsiders who could never know their true nature. And they had to accept belief systems that contradicted everything they had been taught about morality and spirituality while appearing completely normal to friends, colleagues, and neighbors. The families developed sophisticated testing procedures that could evaluate candidates' suitability without revealing the full extent of their activities. They created scenarios that tested loyalty, discretion, and psychological flexibility while providing plausible explanations for unusual requests or situations. They monitored candidates' behavior over extended periods, looking for signs of instability or unreliability that might pose security risks. And they maintained detailed psychological profiles that could predict how individuals might react to increasingly intense levels of involvement in their practices. The initiation processes that transformed candidates into family members were elaborate ceremonies that created permanent psychological bonds while providing final opportunities to eliminate those who proved unsuitable. These rituals were designed to test every aspect of a candidate's character while gradually introducing them to the full reality of their new family's activities. The process was so intensive and traumatic that few candidates completed it successfully, but those who did became some of the most dedicated and effective family members. The family's internal governance systems evolved to accommodate their growing complexity while maintaining the security and efficiency that their survival required. They developed hierarchical structures that distributed authority according to expertise and demonstrated loyalty while ensuring that critical decisions remained in the hands of senior family members whose commitment was beyond question. They created specialized roles that maximized individual strengths while minimizing exposure to activities that might compromise psychological stability. And they established communication protocols that could coordinate complex operations across vast distances without leaving traces that investigators could follow. The most senior positions within these hierarchies were reserved for individuals who had demonstrated exceptional loyalty, competence, and psychological stability over extended periods. These leaders were responsible for making strategic decisions that affected their family's long term survival while managing the day to day operations that maintained their dual existence. They had to balance the competing demands of preserving their traditions and adapting to changing circumstances while ensuring that their activities remained completely concealed from outside observers. The family's intelligence operations became increasingly sophisticated as they recognized that their survival depended on maintaining comprehensive awareness of potential threats while gathering information that could be used to protect their interests. They cultivated relationships with individuals in law enforcement, government agencies, and religious organizations who could provide inside information about investigations or other dangerous developments. They monitored the activities of researchers, journalists, and other outsiders who might accidentally discover evidence of their practices, and they maintained detailed profiles of their neighbors that helped them predict how different individuals might react to suspicious behavior. These intelligence networks required careful coordination between family members who had infiltrated various institutions and those who remained focused on their ritual activities. Information had to be gathered, analyzed, and acted upon without creating connections that could expose the entire network. This required sophisticated communication systems that could operate across long distances without leaving traces that investigators could follow, along with analytical capabilities that could identify patterns and predict future developments based on fragmentary information. The family's approach to law enforcement became increasingly nuanced as they recognized that different situations required different strategies for preventing official investigations while maintaining the appearance of cooperation when contact was unavoidable. They cultivated relationships with local sheriffs and deputies that provided them with advance warning of potential problems while establishing their reputations as law-abiding citizens whose character was above suspicion. They made strategic donations to political campaigns that ensured friendly officials would be in positions of authority when decisions affecting their interests were made. And they developed elaborate systems for destroying evidence and creating alibis that could withstand casual scrutiny while avoiding activities that might provoke intensive investigation. The most effective aspect of their law enforcement strategy was their ability to redirect official attention away from their actual activities while providing plausible explanations for any suspicious evidence that might be discovered. They maintained cover stories that explained unusual purchases, unexplained absences, and other potentially incriminating behavior in ways that satisfied investigators without revealing their true purposes. They had alibis prepared for key family members that could account for their whereabouts during times when ceremonies were conducted, often involving legitimate activities that provided perfect cover for their actual movements. The family's disposal and concealment methods became increasingly sophisticated as they recognized that physical evidence posed their greatest security risk. They developed procedures for completely destroying organic materials that could incriminate them if discovered by authorities. They created chemical processing facilities that could break down complex substances into unidentifiable components, and they established burial sites that were designed to prevent the discovery of remains that might raise uncomfortable questions about their activities. The most challenging aspect of evidence disposal was ensuring that their methods didn't create new risks while eliminating existing ones. They had to balance thoroughness with efficiency, ensuring that materials were completely destroyed while avoiding processes that might attract attention through unusual emissions, sounds, or other detectable signatures. They developed timing procedures that could coordinate disposal activities with natural events that would mask any unusual phenomena. And they created backup systems that could handle evidence disposal even if their primary methods were compromised or unavailable. The family's psychological conditioning systems became increasingly refined as they recognized that their long-term survival depended on maintaining absolute loyalty among their members while adapting to changing social conditions that might affect their indoctrination methods. They developed more subtle approaches to childhood conditioning that could create deep psychological bonds without using techniques that might be recognized as abusive by modern standards. They incorporated contemporary psychological research into their methods while maintaining the essential elements that had proven effective over generations. And they created support systems that could help family members manage the psychological stress of maintaining their dual existence without compromising their loyalty or effectiveness. The most sophisticated aspect of their conditioning systems was how they created genuine believers rather than mere participants who complied out of fear or habit. Through carefully controlled exposure to their ritual practices, combined with elaborate philosophical frameworks that explained their significance, these families produced individuals who genuinely believed their ceremonies served essential purposes that justified any sacrifice necessary to preserve them. These weren't people who participated reluctantly in activities they knew were wrong, but true believers who considered their practices morally superior to conventional behavior. The family's adaptation to modern communication technologies presented both opportunities and challenges that required careful consideration of how these tools might affect their security while enhancing their operational capabilities. They were among the early adopters of encrypted communication systems that could facilitate coordination between distant family members while maintaining complete privacy from outside observers. They developed protocols for using electronic devices in ways that enhanced their ritual effectiveness while avoiding electromagnetic interference that might compromise their ceremonial outcomes. And they created backup communication systems that could maintain their operations even if their primary methods were disrupted or compromised. The integration of communication technology into their practices required extensive testing to ensure that electronic devices didn't interfere with the subtle energies they believed their ceremonies manipulated. They conducted systematic experiments to determine which technologies were compatible with their spiritual activities and which created interference that diminished their effectiveness. They developed shielding methods that could protect sensitive ceremonial areas from electromagnetic radiation while maintaining the connectivity needed for their operations. And they established protocols for using technology in ways that enhanced rather than diminished their ritual power. The family's financial operations became increasingly complex as they adapted to modern banking systems while maintaining their traditional resource allocation methods. They established multiple legitimate businesses that provided cover for their activities while generating substantial income required to support their operations. They developed investment strategies that could multiply their resources over time while avoiding patterns that might attract unwanted attention from regulatory authorities. And they created distribution networks that could move money and materials across vast distances without leaving traceable connections to their ritual activities. The most successful financial strategies were those that achieved perfect integration between their legitimate enterprises and their ceremonial needs. They established businesses that naturally required the same materials used in their rituals, created employment opportunities for family members that provided cover for their real activities, and developed customer relationships that could be leveraged to obtain information or resources when needed. This integration was so seamless that outside observers would never suspect that apparently normal businesses were actually supporting elaborate ritual practices. The 7 families, whose stories I'm about to reveal, each developed unique approaches to these fundamental challenges, creating different solutions to the problem of maintaining ancient traditions in a modern world that had no place for such practices. Their stories illuminate different aspects of this hidden history, revealing how these dark traditions adapted and evolved while maintaining their essential character across generations of secrecy and deception. What makes these particular accounts so compelling is not just their individual uniqueness, but how they collectively demonstrate the sophisticated methods that these families employed to survive and flourish in environments that should have made their activities impossible to sustain. These families understood that their ultimate survival depended on creating systems so resilient and adaptable that they could withstand any challenge while maintaining the essential spiritual power that justified their existence. They recognized that their traditions weren't simply historical curiosities, but living practices that required constant nurturing and evolution to remain effective, and they accepted that preserving these traditions would require sacrifices that ordinary people couldn't understand or accept, sacrifices that they considered not just necessary, but sacred duties that connected them to forces beyond ordinary human comprehension. The geographic isolation that had originally protected these families became less reliable as transportation improved and development expanded into previously remote areas. They recognized that physical isolation alone wouldn't guarantee their security and began developing more sophisticated concealment methods that could hide their activities even in increasingly populated areas. They established urban safe houses that could support their operations while providing perfect cover through their integration into normal city life. They created mobile operational capabilities that could conduct their ceremonies in temporary locations while avoiding the security risks associated with permanent facilities. The family's approach to modern surveillance technology required careful consideration of how these systems might affect their security while providing opportunities to enhance their own intelligence capabilities. They studied the capabilities and limitations of various surveillance systems to develop countermeasures that could protect their activities while avoiding detection. They incorporated surveillance technology into their own security systems while ensuring that their methods didn't create vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile observers. And they developed protocols for operating in environments with extensive surveillance coverage while maintaining their operational effectiveness. The most challenging aspect of adapting to modern surveillance was recognizing that their traditional security methods weren't adequate for environments where their activities could be monitored remotely and recorded for later analysis. They had to develop new approaches to operational security that could protect their activities from electronic observation while maintaining the spiritual effectiveness that their ceremonies required. They created shielding methods that could protect sensitive areas from various forms of surveillance while avoiding techniques that might themselves attract attention. And they established procedures for detecting and neutralizing surveillance systems that threatened their security. The family's recruitment strategies had to evolve as they recognized that modern society produced different types of individuals than their traditional selection methods were designed to identify. They developed new psychological profiles that could identify candidates who possess the characteristics needed for successful integration into their communities while adapting to contemporary social conditions. They created evaluation procedures that could assess candidates' suitability without revealing the full extent of their activities while providing opportunities to eliminate those who proved unsuitable. And they established integration processes that could transform outsiders into loyal family members while maintaining the security and effectiveness that their survival required. The most valuable recruits were those who possessed professional skills that could benefit their operations while demonstrating the psychological characteristics needed for their dual existence. They actively sought individuals with expertise in chemistry, biology, psychology, and other fields that could enhance their ritual capabilities while providing legitimate career paths that enhanced their public personas. They developed elaborate courtship procedures that allowed them to evaluate candidates thoroughly while gradually introducing them to increasingly sensitive aspects of their family life. And they created initiation processes that transformed outsiders into devoted family members while providing final opportunities to eliminate those who proved unsuitable. The family's educational strategies became increasingly sophisticated as they recognized that their members needed advanced skills to navigate modern society while maintaining their traditional practices. They encouraged family members to pursue higher education in fields that could benefit their operations while ensuring that academic achievement didn't compromise loyalty to family traditions. They developed mentorship programs that paired experienced family members with younger individuals who showed particular promise, creating knowledge transfer systems that preserved critical expertise while adapting it to contemporary circumstances. And they established scholarship programs that could support family members' educational pursuits while maintaining control over their development and commitment. The most successful educational investments were in fields that provided practical skills for their operations while establishing legitimate career paths that enhanced their public personas. Family members pursued advanced degrees in chemistry, biology, psychology, business administration, and law enforcement, acquiring expertise that could be applied to their ritual activities while building professional reputations that provided perfect cover for their real interests. Some achieved positions of significant authority within their chosen fields, using their influence to protect family interests while appearing to be model citizens whose character was beyond question. The family's adaptation to modern medical knowledge presented both opportunities and challenges that required careful consideration of how contemporary healthcare might affect their traditional practices. They recognized that modern medicine could enhance their understanding of the physiological processes involved in their rituals while providing new methods for achieving their ceremonial objectives. They incorporated medical technology into their practices while ensuring that their methods didn't compromise the spiritual effectiveness that their ceremonies required, and they developed relationships with medical professionals who could provide services and information that supported their activities while maintaining complete discretion about their true purposes. The most valuable medical relationships were with professionals who shared their philosophical perspectives or could be convinced to provide services without asking uncomfortable questions about their applications. They cultivated relationships with doctors, nurses, and medical researchers who could provide access to specialized knowledge, equipment, and materials that enhanced their ritual capabilities. They developed cover stories that explained their medical needs while avoiding explanations that might reveal their true purposes, and they created backup medical support systems that could provide critical services even if their primary relationships were compromised or unavailable. The family's approach to modern transportation systems required careful consideration of how these technologies might affect their security while providing opportunities to enhance their operational capabilities. They recognized that modern transportation could facilitate coordination between distant family members while creating new vulnerabilities that had to be carefully managed. They developed protocols for using various transportation methods while maintaining their security and avoiding patterns that might attract unwanted attention. And they created backup transportation systems that could maintain their operations even if their primary methods were disrupted or compromised. The most effective transportation strategies were those that achieved perfect integration between their legitimate travel needs and their ceremonial requirements. They established businesses that naturally required regular travel between their operational areas while providing cover for their real activities. They developed relationships with transportation providers who could facilitate their movements while maintaining complete discretion about their purposes. And they created mobile operational capabilities that could conduct their ceremonies in various locations while avoiding the security risks associated with permanent facilities. The family's financial operations became increasingly sophisticated as they adapted to modern banking systems while maintaining their traditional resource allocation methods. They established multiple legitimate businesses that provided cover for their activities while generating substantial income required to support their operations. They developed investment strategies that could multiply their resources over time while avoiding patterns that might attract unwanted attention from regulatory authorities. And they created distribution networks that could move money and materials across vast distances without leaving traceable connections to their ritual activities. The most successful financial strategies were those that achieved perfect integration between their legitimate enterprises and their ceremonial needs. They established businesses that naturally required the same materials used in their rituals while providing employment opportunities for family members that enhanced their public personas. They developed customer relationships that could be leveraged to obtain information or resources when needed, while maintaining their reputations as trustworthy business partners. And they created investment portfolios that could support their operations indefinitely while avoiding activities that might compromise their security or effectiveness. These 7 families, each with their own unique approach to maintaining their dark traditions in an increasingly modern world, represent the most sophisticated examples of how ancient practices could evolve and adapt while preserving their essential character. Their stories reveal the extraordinary lengths to which these communities went to ensure their survival, the sophisticated methods they developed to conceal their activities, and the profound psychological conditioning that maintained their members' loyalty across generations of secrecy and deception. What makes these accounts particularly chilling is not just their individual content, but how they collectively demonstrate the possibility that similar practices might still be continuing today, hidden within communities that have perfected the art of concealment beyond anything their ancestors could have imagined. The evidence suggests that these practices haven't simply vanished into historical obscurity. In counties throughout Appalachia, unexplained disappearances continue to occur with disturbing regularity, following patterns that mirror the activities of these historical families. Missing persons cases that receive minimal media attention, investigations that stall without explanation, and physical evidence that disappears from official custody before analysis can be completed. Local law enforcement agencies report equipment malfunctions and communication failures when attempting to investigate certain remote areas, phenomena that can't be explained through conventional understanding of technology or geography. Modern forensic techniques have revealed troubling inconsistencies in official records from areas where these families once operated. Carbon dating of materials found at suspected ritual sites indicates recent activity, not historical artifacts from centuries past. DNA analysis of organic samples has identified genetic markers that match known descendants of these family lines, suggesting that bloodline traditions continue to influence contemporary activities. And satellite imagery has captured thermal signatures in remote locations that indicate large gatherings occurring during specific lunar phases, gatherings that disperse before ground investigation can determine their purpose. The psychological profile of individuals raised within these family systems creates long-term effects that persist throughout their lives, regardless of whether they continue active participation in their family's traditions. Mental health professionals working in rural Appalachian communities report encountering patients whose symptoms don't match conventional diagnostic categories, individuals who display unusual responses to standard therapeutic approaches and demonstrate knowledge of subjects they claim never to have studied. These patients often exhibit extraordinary abilities to compartmentalize traumatic experiences while maintaining functional relationships with family members who may have been involved in their trauma. Treatment of these individuals presents unique challenges because their psychological conditioning makes them extremely resistant to therapeutic interventions that might reveal family secrets. They display sophisticated defense mechanisms that protect sensitive information while allowing them to function normally in most social situations. Many demonstrate remarkable abilities to detect when they're being evaluated or tested, adapting their responses to avoid revealing information that might compromise their family's security. And those who do begin to open up about their experiences often suffer mysterious accidents or medical emergencies that interrupt their treatment before significant progress can be made. The children currently being raised within these communities face challenges that exceed anything their ancestors experienced, as modern society provides both enhanced opportunities for exposure and more sophisticated methods for concealment. They must navigate educational systems that teach values fundamentally incompatible with their family traditions while maintaining perfect academic performance that avoids attracting attention. They interact with peers who have access to information and communication technologies that could potentially reveal their family's activities, requiring constant vigilance to prevent accidental disclosure. And they must prepare for adult lives that will demand even greater sophistication in maintaining their dual existence as society becomes increasingly interconnected and transparent. The recruitment of new members continues through carefully orchestrated encounters that appear completely natural but are actually elaborate screening processes designed to identify suitable candidates. These encounters often occur in settings where targets are emotionally vulnerable, such as during personal crises, relationship difficulties, or financial hardships that make them receptive to offers of support and community. The families have developed sophisticated psychological profiles that help them identify individuals whose personality characteristics make them suitable for integration into their communities while possessing skills or resources that would benefit their operations. The courtship process for potential new members can extend over months or years, involving gradual introduction to increasingly unusual concepts and activities that test their psychological flexibility and moral boundaries. Candidates are exposed to philosophical frameworks that challenge conventional ethical standards while providing alternative moral systems that justify behaviors most people would consider unacceptable. They participate in group activities that create emotional bonds and shared experiences while gradually revealing the true nature of their new community's practices. And they undergo psychological conditioning that creates dependency relationships while eliminating their connections to outside support systems. The initiation rituals that transform candidates into family members have evolved to incorporate modern psychological techniques while maintaining their traditional spiritual elements. These ceremonies are designed to create permanent changes in personality structure that ensure absolute loyalty while providing final opportunities to eliminate candidates who prove unsuitable for their new roles. The process involves controlled trauma that breaks down existing identity structures while providing new frameworks for understanding themselves and their place in the world. And the experience creates shared secrets so profound that betrayal would require complete psychological reconstruction that most individuals aren't capable of achieving. The family's adaptation to modern communication technologies has created new opportunities for coordination while introducing security challenges that require constant vigilance to manage effectively. They utilize encrypted messaging systems that appear to be ordinary social media communications but contain hidden meanings that only family members can interpret. They coordinate activities through online gaming platforms that provide perfect cover for complex logistical planning while appearing to be recreational activities. And they maintain databases of information that appear to be legitimate business records but actually contain detailed intelligence about potential threats and opportunities. The integration of technology into their ritual practices has enhanced their capabilities while maintaining the spiritual effectiveness that their ceremonies require. They use sophisticated monitoring equipment to track environmental conditions that affect their ritual outcomes while avoiding electronic interference that might compromise their spiritual objectives. They employ medical devices that can precisely control physiological processes during their ceremonies while maintaining the organic elements that their traditions require. And they utilize communication systems that can coordinate simultaneous activities across multiple locations while preserving the energetic connections that their practices depend upon. The family's financial operations have evolved to take advantage of modern economic systems while maintaining complete separation between their legitimate enterprises and their ritual activities. They operate businesses that generate substantial profits while providing perfect cover for their real purposes, creating employment opportunities for family members that enhance their public personas while supporting their private activities. They maintain investment portfolios that can support their operations indefinitely while avoiding patterns that might attract regulatory attention. And they utilize financial instruments that can move large sums of money across international boundaries while maintaining complete anonymity about their true purposes. The most successful financial strategies involve creating businesses that naturally require the same materials and services used in their rituals while generating products that appeal to unsuspecting customers. They operate farms that produce organic materials for their ceremonies while selling surplus crops to health food stores and restaurants. They run chemical supply companies that provide specialized substances for their rituals while serving legitimate industrial customers. And they maintain transportation companies that can move their materials and personnel while providing normal shipping services to ordinary businesses. The family's intelligence operations have expanded to take advantage of modern information systems while maintaining the human networks that provide their most valuable insights. They cultivate relationships with individuals in technology companies who can provide access to communication systems and data storage facilities that enhance their operational capabilities. They maintain contacts within government agencies who can provide advance warning of investigations while ensuring that official attention is directed away from their activities. And they develop relationships with academic researchers who can provide scientific knowledge that enhances their understanding of the natural phenomena they manipulate through their rituals. The most valuable intelligence assets are those who occupy positions of authority within institutions that could potentially threaten their security while possessing personal characteristics that make them susceptible to manipulation or coercion. They identify individuals whose career advancement depends on maintaining certain relationships while demonstrating vulnerabilities that can be exploited when cooperation is required. They cultivate these relationships through carefully orchestrated encounters that create obligations and dependencies while providing valuable services that ensure continued cooperation. And they maintain detailed profiles of these assets that allow them to predict their behavior and ensure their continued loyalty. The family's approach to modern surveillance technology has required the development of sophisticated countermeasures that can protect their activities while avoiding detection by increasingly capable monitoring systems. They employ electronic jammers that can disrupt surveillance equipment while appearing to be natural electromagnetic phenomena. They utilize camouflage techniques that can conceal their activities from satellite observation while maintaining access to the natural features their ceremonies require. And they develop protocols for operating in urban environments where traditional concealment methods aren't effective while maintaining their operational security. The most effective surveillance countermeasures are those that redirect attention away from their actual activities while providing plausible explanations for any unusual phenomena that might be detected. They create legitimate activities that generate similar signatures to their ritual practices while conducting their real ceremonies in locations that appear to be engaged in normal business operations. They utilize natural events that can mask their activities while providing cover for their movements and communications. And they develop backup procedures that can maintain their operations even if their primary concealment methods are compromised or detected. The family's recruitment strategies have evolved to take advantage of modern social conditions while maintaining their traditional selection criteria for identifying suitable candidates. They target individuals who are experiencing social isolation or personal crises that make them receptive to offers of community and support. They utilize online platforms that can identify people with specific psychological profiles while providing opportunities for initial contact that appear completely natural. And they develop elaborate cover stories that explain their interest in potential recruits while concealing their true purposes until candidates have been thoroughly evaluated. The most successful recruitment operations involve creating situations where targets encounter multiple family members in different contexts, creating the impression of widespread social acceptance while actually being carefully orchestrated encounters designed to evaluate and influence potential candidates. They establish legitimate businesses and organizations that provide natural meeting places while serving as front operations for their real activities. They participate in community events and charitable activities that enhance their public reputations while providing opportunities to identify and evaluate potential recruits. And they create social networks that can provide ongoing contact with candidates while maintaining complete separation from their ritual activities. The family's educational strategies have expanded to take advantage of modern academic institutions while ensuring that their members acquire the knowledge and skills necessary for maintaining their traditions in contemporary society. They encourage family members to pursue advanced degrees in fields that can benefit their operations while maintaining careful control over their development and commitment. They establish scholarship programs that can support their members' educational pursuits while ensuring that academic achievement doesn't compromise their loyalty to family traditions. And they develop mentorship programs that pair experienced family members with younger individuals who show particular promise for future leadership roles. The most valuable educational investments are in fields that provide practical skills for their operations while establishing legitimate career paths that enhance their public personas and provide access to resources and information that benefit their activities. They encourage family members to pursue degrees in chemistry, biology, psychology, and medicine that can enhance their understanding of the physiological and psychological processes involved in their rituals. They support studies in business administration and law that can improve their ability to manage their financial operations and protect their legal interests. And they promote careers in law enforcement and government service that can provide inside information about investigations while ensuring that official attention is directed away from their activities. The family's medical operations have evolved to incorporate modern healthcare knowledge while maintaining their traditional approaches to healing and physical manipulation. They establish relationships with medical professionals who can provide services and information that support their activities while maintaining complete discretion about their true purposes. They utilize modern diagnostic equipment that can monitor physiological processes during their ceremonies while ensuring that their interventions don't compromise the spiritual effectiveness of their rituals. And they develop pharmaceutical capabilities that can produce specialized substances for their ceremonies while maintaining the organic elements that their traditions require. The most valuable medical relationships are with professionals who share their philosophical perspectives or can be convinced to provide services without asking uncomfortable questions about their applications. They cultivate relationships with doctors who specialize in alternative medicine while maintaining conventional medical practices that provide cover for their real interests. They develop connections with researchers who study consciousness and altered states while providing them with opportunities to observe phenomena that conventional science can't explain. And they maintain relationships with pharmaceutical companies that can provide access to specialized compounds while ensuring that their true purposes remain concealed. The family's transportation systems have evolved to take advantage of modern logistics capabilities while maintaining their traditional requirements for secrecy and security. They operate legitimate transportation companies that can move their materials and personnel while providing normal shipping services to ordinary customers. They maintain private aircraft and marine vessels that can reach remote locations while avoiding commercial transportation systems that might create records of their movements. And they develop mobile operational capabilities that can conduct their ceremonies in various locations while avoiding the security risks associated with permanent facilities. The most effective transportation strategies involve creating businesses that naturally require regular movement between their operational areas while providing cover for their real activities. They establish courier services that can transport sensitive materials while appearing to be normal business operations. They operate tourism companies that can provide access to remote locations while maintaining their reputations as legitimate recreational businesses. And they develop emergency response capabilities that can react quickly to security threats while maintaining their operational effectiveness. The seven families, whose stories have been revealed, represent only the most visible examples of communities that have successfully maintained their dark traditions while adapting to the challenges of modern society. Their success demonstrates that ancient practices can evolve and flourish even in environments that should make their activities impossible to sustain. What makes these accounts particularly disturbing is how they reveal the sophisticated methods that these communities have developed to conceal their activities while maintaining their essential character across generations of secrecy and deception. The evidence suggests that these practices continue to spread and evolve, adapting to new technologies and social conditions while preserving their fundamental spiritual objectives. The families have created systems so resilient and sophisticated that they can withstand any investigation while maintaining their operational effectiveness. They have developed recruitment methods that can identify and integrate new members while preserving their security and traditions. And they have established financial and logistical capabilities that can support their activities indefinitely while avoiding detection by even the most advanced monitoring systems. The mountains of Appalachia continue to harbor secrets that resist all attempts at complete revelation, secrets that have grown more sophisticated and dangerous as they have adapted to contemporary conditions. The families that once struggled to maintain their traditions in isolation now possess capabilities that exceed anything their ancestors could have imagined. They have transformed from primitive mountain communities into sophisticated organizations that can operate anywhere while maintaining their essential character and spiritual power. What began as isolated family traditions has evolved into a network of communities that span continents while maintaining their ancient practices. The children being raised within these systems today will possess capabilities that exceed anything previous generations could have achieved. They will navigate a world where traditional boundaries between sacred and secular, ancient and modern, visible and hidden have been completely dissolved. And they will carry forward traditions that have survived every attempt to destroy them while growing stronger and more sophisticated with each generation. The question isn't whether these practices will continue, but how they will evolve as they encounter new challenges and opportunities in an increasingly connected world. The families have demonstrated their ability to adapt and thrive regardless of external circumstances. They have created systems that can survive any threat while maintaining their essential spiritual character, and they have established traditions that will endure long after conventional society has forgotten that such practices ever existed. In the end, the mountains keep their secrets not because they lack the ability to reveal them, but because revelation would serve no purpose that those secrets don't already serve. The families that maintain these traditions understand that their survival depends not on hiding from the world, but on becoming so integrated into it that their true nature becomes invisible. They have achieved a form of concealment so perfect that they can operate in plain sight while remaining completely undetected, and they have created systems so sophisticated that even those who suspect their existence can never prove it or do anything to stop them. The darkness that once lurked in remote mountain hollows has learned to thrive in the light of modern civilization. What began as primitive rituals conducted in hidden caves has evolved into sophisticated operations that can function anywhere while maintaining their ancient power. The families that once feared discovery now possess capabilities that make detection virtually impossible, and the traditions that once required complete isolation now flourish in environments where they can draw strength from the very systems that were meant to eliminate them. The seven families, whose stories have been revealed, represent not the end of this hidden history, but merely its most visible manifestation. Behind them lie networks of communities that have achieved levels of sophistication and integration that exceed anything documented in these accounts. They have created systems that can adapt to any challenge while preserving their essential character, and they have established traditions that will continue to evolve and spread regardless of what efforts are made to stop them. The mountains of Appalachia will continue to guard their secrets, not because they must, but because they choose to. The families that call these mountains home have learned that the most effective concealment comes not from hiding in shadows, but from becoming the shadows themselves. They have achieved a form of invisibility so perfect that they can operate anywhere while remaining completely undetected, and they have created traditions so resilient that they will endure long after the mountains themselves have been worn away by time.